There have been more clashes on the streets of Athens as the Greek government imposed another round of austerity measures in a bid to ease the country's economic crisis. The policies will ensure Greece receives yet more financial aid from the European lenders, but at what price to the Greek people? Hello and welcome to Eyewitness. I'm John Rees. The measures put in place are so severe that many fear that they are impossible to implement in a democratic state. But has democracy now been subverted in Greece? Many Greeks now say that their country has become a slave to its lenders in the IMF and the European Union. Crutcher reports.
Athens, the ancient city, in flames. On Sunday, crowds once again gathered outside Parliament to protest against the latest raft of austerity measures being debated behind its doors. MPs eventually voted in favour of a series of tax rises and public spending cuts, including the loss of 15,000 jobs and slashing the minimum wage by 20%. In a country where unemployment is at a record high and poverty is estimated to have engulfed more than 1/3 of the population, the measures are hard for the Greek people to bear. Yet, the government insists that this is the only way forward if Greece is to receive a further 130 billion euros in bailouts from its troika of creditors, the International Monetary Fund, European Union and European Central Bank. Many, however, remain far from convinced. For a start, the Greeks probably won't see a single cent of this next instalment, most of which will be used to pay off debts in a bid to avoid outright bankruptcy in March. Europe's demands don't end there. As part of the original deal, Greece is supposed to sell off 50 billion euros of state assets. It has so far managed only a fraction of this. In reality, Greece, the cradle of democracy, is now anything but. European creditors and banks dictate government policy. Corrupt, bloated and inefficient, its public administration has come to a standstill. With no focus on growth and economic recession now in its 5th consecutive year, further austerity looks likely to plunge the country into deeper poverty. Many in Europe see default as inevitable. The anger of the Athenian street is clear. Polls put confidence in the government at 8%. Graffiti calls on the people to rise in rebellion and to fight against becoming slaves to Berlin, their principal creditors. The interim government has announced plans to hold elections in April. Europe wants assurances that the agreed austerity programme will continue after then. Convincing an angry electorate of this will be a different matter entirely.
Well, joining me in the studio today is James Meadway from the New Economics Foundation. Also on the phone from Greece, we have film director Aris Chatzistefanou. Welcome to you both. James, this is an unprecedented level of austerity being imposed on the Greek population.
Well, it's unprecedented for any European society, I think. I mean, bear in mind what's happening to Greece is something along the lines of what the IMF has always done when it's turned up for countries that are deemed to be in economic trouble, which is what they used to call structural adjustment programmes, which is, you say, privatise everything that moves, cut taxes for the rich, close down public services, cut public spending, remove all subsidies on food, on fuel, on basics of life, and then hopefully at the end of all this, your economy will recover and everything will be fine. Now, that's the line from the IMF at the moment. It's the same line that the Greek government is pushing, that although it looks really unpleasant now, and it is deeply, deeply unpleasant, as your reporter said, eventually everything will recover and Greece will emerge a stronger economy. Now, what I think we have to say at this point is that after 5 years of recession, the Greek economy has shrunk by 20% over that period of time. That's comparable, by the way, to the shrinking of the US economy in the Great Depression of the 1930s, that really there's no real exit strategy or plan out of this. There's no real prospects of growth or recovery. That all we've really got from the IMF and the Troika, the various creditors, is, well, we'll just keep doing austerity, we'll keep doing it until eventually we hope something might turn up, but in the meantime, just keep making the payments, keep making the interest payments, keep repaying the debt, and frankly, we probably don't care that much what happens to your entire society.
Aris, let me just bring you into the discussion here. Do you think that this has now reached a point where it's simply unsustainable politically in Greece?
What we saw last Sunday was actually the collapse of the political system that was created after the end of the dictatorship in 1974. We now have a government with a non-elected prime minister who was actually a former vice president of the European Central Bank and a central banker of Greece. We have neo-fascists inside the government, and none of the big parties have the majority to represent the people. They say that PASOK, who was the winner to the last elections, the so-called socialists, now have something like 8% according to the opinion polls. So the political system has collapsed. But unfortunately, in the 2 years' time that it had the ability to find an alternative solution, these people were just working for foreign and Greek financial institutions. What they did was to give times to the lenders to get rid of the Greek bonds, to send it back to the European Central Bank, and in that way send it to European taxpayers, while at the same time they were destroying whatever the working movement of the 20th century managed to succeed in doing. We are now living under conditions that we haven't seen in Greece from the 19th century, and I'm talking literally about that. And we saw this collapse this Sunday while we had one of the biggest demonstrations in Greek history. And it's funny here, we have to mention that there was not a single image of the demonstration to the Greek TV stations. They all wanted to show to their audience just the destruction of some buildings and the fire that erupted after the riot. I'm afraid that...
Aris, just let me get that clear a moment, because I don't think many people in this country have heard that point. Are you saying that the main TV stations showed nothing of the major demonstration?
Yeah, if you haven't been in Syntagma Square, where the central square of Athens with the Parliament building, you would have seen an empty space because police intervened from the first minute with excessive use of tear gas in order to empty the square, so that all the Greek and the foreign media that they had cameras in big hotels around the square could have a footage of an empty square, while in the streets around Syntagma Square, one of the biggest demonstrations in Greek history was taking place. Just to give you a comparison, according to the Greek population, it was something like what you have seen before the invasion of Iraq with the big Stop the War movement and the anti-war protests.
I mean, James, that's remarkable, because I mean, to anybody who's been following the events of the last year in the Arab Spring, that unforgettably brings back the sort of memory of the Egyptian state television, for instance, filming empty streets when Tahrir Square was rammed with protesters. I mean, there is a system failure in a major political state in Europe now, isn't there?
And it kind of looks fairly similar both sides of the Mediterranean. That if you take unemployment generally in Greece, which is something around 20%, for those under the age of 25, it's 50 to 60%. It is well over half. You know, the young population in Greece is now out of work. Similar conditions in Egypt and other Arab countries, where again you had the combination of failed, what you'd call neoliberal economic policies, the idea that you can privatise, that you cut spending, that you let the market determine how your society is going to be run. That fails, and then it combines with this major political failure on top of it. In the case of the Arab Spring, much more obviously dictatorial. In the case of Greece, this is supposed to be not just the cradle of democracy, but a modern democracy, a member of the EU. But now we find that essentially the previous elected government was quietly escorted out of office. We now have a government, as Aris says, of bankers, of a former central banker heading this up. The promise of elections in April, but even then we find that the EU and the IMF are demanding of the main Greek political parties that they sign up to an agreement beforehand saying they won't break with the promises they've made on more austerity before the election. So what choice you'll get in that election remains to be seen. Of course, whether the election even goes ahead is a faintly moot point at this stage. As Aris says, the status of Greek democracy, the way the thing is supposed to function, really does hang in the balance, I feel, at the moment.
Aris, just let me ask you about that point, because that is a remarkable fact about the political situation, that the bankers are essentially telling Greek political parties what their election manifestos can and can't include. What impact is that having on ordinary people in Greece?
The effect of having a banker in negotiation with other bankers in the European Union. There's actually no one to represent the will of the people at the moment. Just to give you an example, the Prime Minister, as I've said, was a former banker, and the new team that he brought in government were either former members of Goldman Sachs or members of the biggest banks in Greece. And now they are talking with the IMF and other institutions in which they are members. So we have more like a banking deal and not a real government representing the will of the people. The problem, of course, is that there is no political power at the moment able to express this anger of the people. The left-wing parties inside the parliament were slow, I would say, to react and to bring forward a new strategy, an alternative strategy to all these problems. And now we are seeing the people in a state of shock, actually.
James, if we're looking for, and I think it's important to do this because I think people have difficulty kind of really grasping what the scale of the crisis is here. They're unused in the post-war period in Europe, at any rate, to seeing a society with this level of unemployment, this level of wage cuts and so forth. And I suppose the obvious historic parallel is with the Weimar Republic, with a kind of unstable democratic entity which is being crushed to death by the economic and social forces that are being unleashed by the crisis. Is that on the sort of historical scale, is that a fair comparison, do you think?
Well, as I said, just on the numbers alone, the shrinking of the Greek economy over the last few years is about equivalent to the shrinking of the American economy during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. So just looking at the figures, you can start to see that. And the scale of unemployment is certainly comparable. And also the kind of policies that are being implemented bear an uncanny resemblance to some of the stuff that was tried in the 1930s, that the response of governments in the 30s in many countries was to say, OK, we're in a recession, we can't afford to pay for unemployment benefit or to pay for public works or to pay for public spending. We have to balance the books, therefore we should cut and cut again. This, of course, just worsens a recession. This is how you turn a sharp recession into a severe depression very rapidly. And that was kind of a lesson that was eventually, I think, learned out of the 1930s. Once you got through the chaos of the 30s, through the Second World War, it was a lesson that you thought governments had learned. And what we're going through now appears to be a repeat, at least in the level of economic policy, certainly from what is being ordered from Berlin and other European powers for Greece and for other indebted smaller European nations. It is a kind of repeat of the failed stuff of the 1930s. The consequences of that politically appear to be absolutely, in the case of Greece, catastrophic. That the idea that since the Second World War you had essentially stable democracies that provided some kind of parliamentary representation, that provided a kind of welfare state that would give you a health service, free education, all these other provisions, that I think is being very, very dramatically eroded. Because it's not just in Greece that we suddenly find a government of the bankers being imposed, regardless of who anybody wants to vote for. Italy, it's the same thing. You know, the reshuffling that takes place at the top of the European Central Bank, this massively powerful institution that no one elects, and it makes its own policies and it determines what happens across the rest of the entire continent. So democracy and the welfare state are the two things that were gained in Europe after the Second World War that we now start to see, I think, quite seriously being eroded.
Aris, the film that you made, Debtocracy, was in some ways an initial reaction to the 2008 slump and a prediction that things like this might unfold, a kind of map of the territory that we are now in. I mean, it's been a fantastic hit. I think something like 2 million views online and so forth. But are you surprised now by the scale of this? Has it even overwhelmed the kind of predictions that you had in mind when you made the film?
Unfortunately, yes. You know, even talking about the title, Debtocracy, which for us is the opposite of democracy, it's the situation that we are living now. What we were trying to explain with this documentary was that if you have a public debt of 360 billion euros, it's not only about economy, it's about the society, it's about the political system, it's about economic and financial invasion from foreign powers, and not only foreign powers, of course, it's the Greek economic elite that played the same role in this situation. We knew, unfortunately, what would happen, and the problem is that everybody knew about that. Everybody knew that there was no way to repay this debt, which actually has many characteristics as being illegal or odious, but that's not the point at the moment. We knew that it was impossible to repay the debt. So we have to ask why all these people were putting pressure for something that even a student of economics in the first year of university could understand that it is impossible. And I'm afraid it's what I was saying before, that they wanted to get rid of the Greek bonds. They wanted to change the working rights of Greek people. There are other small but very important details for us. For example, no one really talks about the fact that the Greek debt was created under the Greek law, which in case of a default you have many advantages because your lenders have to come to the Greek courts and try to make an arrangement here. What they are doing now by the new loans, it's to change the characteristic of this debt and bringing to the British law, which is the worst case scenario for a small country like Greece. So it was a strategy prepared many years in advance in order to bring Greece in this situation. And of course, it's not only Greece, it's about and feel the impact of this policy.
James, how much do you think that, as people watch this happen in Greece, how much do you think they can legitimately say, well, you know, that's happened in Greece, maybe it'll happen in some other places, but it's not going to be a generalisable thing, it won't happen here. Is that realistic, or will it happen here?
As in Britain?
Yes.
You can see parallels, I think, right the way across Europe in the first instance with what's happening in Greece. The mechanism here is that if you have a heavily indebted country, or even a moderately indebted, which is kind of what Britain is, and you have a government that commits itself to saying we must repay that debt as fast as possible, what you end up doing is undermining the economy itself. You chip away at demand. You say we're going to cut public spending. You take demand out of the economy. That means firms can't sell. That means they cut wages. They make redundancies. You start to generate a recession. You start to generate a dynamic of the whole economy starting to spiral downwards. You see that with incredible force in Greece. Austerity is, without any doubt, making the Greek economy worse and worse and worse. Essentially, it's in a kind of death spiral now as it tries to pursue, and as successive governments try to pursue these policies. But a lesser version of that is starting to happen in any country that is following the same thing. So that does mean Ireland, it does mean Portugal, it does mean Italy, and it certainly means Britain, where you see that the economic news for the last few months now is getting progressively worse. We'll be very lucky if we've not slipped back into recession when the next set of GDP figures come out, because what we have is a government that is not just, you know, the social effects of cuts are pretty horrendous when you hear about people losing their benefits and being chucked out of their homes, or disabled people losing essentially almost the right to live. The social effects are obviously bad, but the economic effects, the fact that when you cut spending on the scale that's being attempted, you trash the entire economy, that's what drives us back into recession, and that's where the parallel starts to become quite stark.
Aris, you're working on a new documentary now, I think. What will you be saying about this? Is this a picture of our future?
Yes, and again, we're playing with the title, which is Catastroika. It is a term first used under the Yeltsin era in Russia, when after the small coup d'etat and the attack against the parliament, they imposed this massive privatization program. And we know from historical examples that this is the future for Greece too. When you have a country and in a condition of shock, when you have a debt trap for this country, it's the easiest thing to sell off the public property and what actually belongs to the people. And we have the first signs. We have officials from the European Union saying that we should follow the Treuhand example. If you remember, Treuhand was the company that was created in Germany after the reunification in order to sell off the property of the former Eastern Germany. They want to impose the same thing here, and it's a unique opportunity for financial institutions to financially invade in the country and take few months ago it was a joke to say to take the islands, but I'm afraid that's the future. They are talking about small islets. They are talking about the biggest corporations that are still profitable, like the electricity company of Greece and many other, the trains. And you have an experience here of what will happen if we privatize the railway system. That's unfortunately one step that they are always willing to take under these circumstances.
So in other words, what we're talking about here is a kind of, within a huge economic crisis, a kind of internal asset stripping process on top of that?
It's a step that I think they're always taking. It's when you're living under economic occupation, it's not only about economics, it's also about politics, and it's about society. We have seen in the political sphere this happening already. As I was telling you, we have members in the parliament and in the government now that they were supporting the dictatorship in Greece 4 decades ago, and now they are ministers like Mr. Voridis. So they took control of the government. They are calling technocrats, and now we will have a reshuffle in the government, and they are all saying that Mr. Papadimos will bring more of his friends, more technocrats to the government, more non-elected officials, and of course there is an opportunity for profit for foreign and Greek companies to take what remains of public property.
James, what do you think is the alternative here? Because, you know, we're always told that this is inevitable, natural, the only thing that can be done. But, I mean, many economists don't see it that way, do they?
No, I don't think so. And I think the argument for an alternative is becoming pressing. I mean, this is what people are demanding very clearly in Greece, that it is impossible to carry on like this. It's simply not sustainable for a society to try and continue to exist in this way. So an alternative is what's being cried out for. Now, for Greece, I think it starts to look like a default. The debt is unpayable. Why bleed yourself white trying to repay it? Because that's kind of what the bailouts and the austerity and all the rest amount to. Simply don't pay it. Frankly, the debt isn't the fault of ordinary Greeks. They shouldn't be the ones who have to suffer for it. So cancel the thing, maybe negotiate with your creditors about what kind of terms you want to repay it over a very long period of time, but get rid of the damn thing. Just drop the debt. That's one part of it. I'd also think it might well be up for discussion. I think if you're going to drop the debt, this certainly becomes the case of an exit from the euro. The idea that you're trapped inside this structure, which is becoming increasingly oppressive, where the European Central Bank does dictate to you precisely how you're going to run your monetary policy and then, therefore, your fiscal policy also, forevermore. Just leave. Get out of it. Of course, there are lots of risks, there are lots of difficulties associated with doing all of this, but it is better than the kind of slow, lingering death that you're looking at here. Those two things, a default, an exit from the euro, start to provide the basis on which you can actually reconstruct the economy. That's the opportunity that's then available. What you've got at the moment is no opportunity like that at all.
Because the strange thing about the debt discussion is that actually the economy itself isn't getting poorer. It's not producing. Well, I mean, its growth is weaker, but it's not half the size that it was a decade ago or something. It's still capable of sustaining the same level of industry, jobs, and services, isn't it?
Well, it is a smaller economy than it was, say, 4 or 5 years ago, because that's the effect of a very very sharp recession. I mean, that's kind of what you're looking at the moment. But that doesn't mean that Greece is suddenly this totally impoverished society. There's lots and lots of things there. There are large numbers of well-educated people you can employ. There are natural resources. There's tourism. There's all sorts of things, but the question of how you start to use that only becomes answerable once you're outside of the incredible burden of debt, and that, as I said, I think simply needs to be defaulted on, and once you're outside of the oppressive structures of the euro and the European Union. That's the two things that have to happen to access all the opportunities that are there.
Well, that's all we've got time for this week. My thanks to James and Aris for joining us, and to you at home for watching. Don't forget to stay in touch. We want to hear your thoughts on these stories as well, so you can find us on Twitter @EyewitnessComment. Till next time, goodbye.